The rain hits the front windows in hard, angry sheets, turning the porch light into a hazy, yellow halo. I hear the tires on the wet pavement first, then 3 car doors slam in quick succession, the sound dull through the storm, but sharp enough that my body tenses. By the time the doorbell shrieks through the house, my fingers are already damp on the security keypad. I glance at the screen of my phone at the black and white camera feed, my parents and my brother huddled under a single umbrella, their clothes plastered to their skin, their faces drawn and desperate. When I open the door, cold air rushes in, smelling like wet asphalt and motel shampoo. "Nora?" Thank God, my mother sobs, mascara running in gray streaks down her cheeks, her voice wobbling the way it used to when I scraped my knees as a kid. My father's shoulders are hunched inside his soaked windbreaker, his eyes flicking over my shoulder at the warm light and the soft throw blanket on the back of the couch. Tyler doesn't even wait. He pushes past them, his boots leaving dirty crescents on my refinished hardwood floors, the leather of his jacket squeaking as he shrugs it off. "You need to fix what you broke." He snaps, his voice low and sharp over the patter of rain. The scent of wet wool, stale fast food, and something sour clings to them as they crowd my entryway, dripping onto the welcome mat I bought myself. I stand barefoot on the cool wood, feeling every inch of the line between inside and outside, between mine and theirs. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Nora Ellis, and most days my world smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee. I'm 31, an ER nurse in Portland, Oregon, and my life runs on fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors. When I close my eyes at night, I still see the pale faces under oxygen masks, the ink-black bruises blooming across ribs, the tiny fingers of kids clutching my sleeve while their parents argue in the hallway. My body is tired more often than not. My feet usually ache by the time I peel my socks off, and there's always a faint sting of hand sanitizer in the cracks of my knuckles. But it's honest work, and for a long time I told myself the exhaustion was a fair trade for doing something that mattered. Home was supposed to be the quiet place after all that noise. Our street is lined with old maple trees that turn the whole block gold in the fall, and the house I grew up in sits right in the middle like a memory that never moved on. The living room smelled like lemon cleaner and the faint musk of my dad's aftershave, and the old HVAC system rattled to life on cold mornings like a grumpy roommate. My mom loved to keep the curtains open so sunlight could spill over her knickknacks. Ceramic birds, glass angels, picture frames arranged just so. On the surface, it looked like any middle-class family home. But if you stood there long enough, you could feel it, the invisible tilt of the room, the way everything seemed to lean toward my younger brother, Tyler. It showed up in small ways at first, in the kind of moments most people would shrug off. My mom's voice got a shade warmer when she said his name. My dad's laughter sat longer on his jokes. When I brought home an honor roll certificate in high school, it got taped on the fridge. Until Tyler scored 8 points in one basketball game, and my paper disappeared under a glossy team photo. He forgot to take the trash out, and my parents joked about boys being boys as the sour smell of last night's leftovers seeped out of the can. I missed one family dinner because I picked up a double shift, and my mother's silence at the table the next week was so heavy I swear I could feel it in my teeth. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was the older one, the responsible one, the one who could handle it. At 19, I studied under flickering dorm lights, while Tyler bounced from one big idea to the next, my parents nodding along to his plans like investors on a TV show. At 25, when my grandmother died and left a modest inheritance, I thought just for a second that it might be the moment things leveled out. I could still smell the old lady perfume on the envelopes the lawyer handed us, the paper rough under my fingers. By the end of that year, the money had vanished into Tyler's sports bar dream, into neon signs and flat-screen TVs, and a menu he never quite finished writing. The bar closed before I ever saw it, but my parents still talked about it like a storm that had blown in from nowhere, not a choice they'd made. When I was 28, I was charting in the triage area, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above my head, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was just after 2 in the morning, the hospital smelling like bleach and burnt coffee, and I almost ignored it. Then I saw my mother's name on the screen. Her sobs hit me before her words did a wet, ragged sound that cut through the hum of the ER like a siren. "We're going to lose the house, Nora," she wailed, her voice high and thin like the whistle of the draft that used to sneak under my bedroom window in winter. "Your father, he made some bad decisions. We're $325,000 behind. They're going to take everything." I remember pressing the phone tighter to my ear, the plastic warm against my cheek, staring at the scuffed linoleum floor as the numbers lodged themselves in my chest. 325,000. I could hear my dad in the background, low and defensive, the clink of ice in a glass cutting through the static. The house flashed in my mind in pieces, the doorframe with my height marks scratched into the wood, the worn spot on the carpet where our old dog used to lie, the way the air smelled like turkey and cinnamon every Thanksgiving. "What about the money Grandma left us?" I asked, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. There was a pause so long I could hear the distant hiss of oxygen down the hallway. "It's gone," my mother whispered. In that moment, with dry hospital air in my lungs and the taste of stale coffee on my tongue, I felt something inside me shift. Logic told me it wasn't my responsibility to fix decades of bad decisions. History told me I would anyway. I signed up for extra shifts, watched the balance on my savings account drain, while the bruised sky outside the hospital windows blurred from sunrise to sunset and back again. My own apartment plans dissolved into the smell of microwave ramen and the sting of another declined night out with coworkers. The first time I put the stack of papers on the dining room table, the wood cool under my palms, the house smelled like roast chicken and my mother's floral perfume. My dad squinted at the pages, the overhead light throwing hard shadows across his tired face. "Just refinancing?" I told them, feeling the lie, like a pebble in my shoe. My mother hesitated, pen hovering her eyes, searching my face for something I wasn't going to say. "This will help us keep the house?" she asked, her voice soft, but edged with that familiar expectation. Outside, the evening air cooled, and I could hear the faint rattle of Mrs. Green's wind chimes next door. I smiled, even though my stomach twisted. "It'll keep everything in the family," I said. And as the pen scratched across the paper, as the ink soaked into the fibers with a faint chemical smell, I had no idea that the line they were signing would one day be the only thing standing between me and an empty house. The hallway smelled like birthday candles and the faint rubber scent from the balloons taped along the walls. I stood at the edge of the dining room carpet, clutching a small wrapped box so tight that the paper crinkled under my fingers. My mother's voice floated through the house, bright and lilting, the way she spoke when company was over. "Tyler, sweetie, make a wish," she called, her earrings glinting in the warm light as she leaned over the cake. The whole room erupted into applause when my brother blew out the candles, the sound rolling like a wave that stopped just before reaching me. Someone brushed past, their perfume sweet and powdery, blocking my view for a moment. When the room settled again, I saw the empty chair at the table, the one they'd told me to give up so the guests could sit. My own slice of cake sat forgotten on the counter, the frosting sliding slightly under the heat of the kitchen lights. I shifted my weight on the cool tile, the edges biting into my bare feet, and waited for someone to notice I hadn't joined the circle. No one did. My mother reached for the gift bags piled beside Tyler's chair, her bracelets chiming softly as she lifted each one. The paper rustled like leaves in a breeze as he tore into the presents. I loosened my grip on the box in my hands, feeling the corner of the ribbon drift against my wrist. When Tyler finally looked toward me, it was only to roll his eyes and turn away again. My father clapped him on the back, the thud heavy in the air. "You earned it, champ," he said, his voice warm with pride. Around them, laughter flickered and glowed like candles on a cake I never got close enough to touch. The moment still lives in my chest with a tight, persistent ache, as if it never finished happening. And sometimes even now, I can still feel the way that ribbon brushed my skin before I let the gift fall quietly to my side. That memory has stayed with me, settling into the spaces between later years, shaping the way I learned to disappear. When I look back, it feels like the camera of my life pulls slowly away from that birthday scene, revealing the long stretch of years that carried the same muted tone. The years when favoritism wasn't a single moment, it was the air we breathed. Growing up in that house, the walls held more than the scent of Sunday roasts or the warm trace of fabric softener on the couch cushions. They seemed to lean slightly toward whoever my brother was in that moment, the budding athlete, the dreamer, with the next big plan, the child whose scraped knee warranted a call to the doctor, while my sprained wrist meant a bag of frozen peas from the freezer. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture the living room on winter afternoons. The dusky blue light pouring through the windows as my father tossed a football to Tyler across the rug. The thump of the ball landing in small hands filled the house with a kind of pride that didn't need words. I would sit at the far end of the couch, the upholstery rough against my legs, tracing the patterns in my homework. My mother's voice always drifted from the kitchen, soft and approving. "Look at that throw. He's a natural." When I'd hold up my test paper, hoping my parents might look a little tilt of the page, the paper still warm from the teacher's copier, they'd offer a polite nod, but never pause the game. That slight dismissal built on itself year after year, settling into my bones like cool air. During holidays, the imbalance showed up even more starkly. Our Christmas mornings were always framed by the sweet smell of cinnamon rolls and the warm glow from the tree lights, blinking in uneven patterns. The living room floor rustled with wrapping paper, the sound crisp and cheerful. Yet every year, no matter what, I unwrapped my mother's attention, drifted toward Tyler's gifts. A new video game, a jacket he'd been wanting, something she'd saved for just the right moment. I remember the feel of a cardigan she gave me one Christmas, soft beige, clearly something she'd picked up last minute while she fussed over the leather boots she'd bought for him. I tried not to let the difference show on my face. I learned early that my feelings only made the room grow colder. My mother had a way of letting silence hang in the air like steam from a boiling pot. The faint hum from the heating vents was often the only sound in those moments, and I learned to fill the quiet with forced gratitude so it wouldn't harden into something worse. It wasn't that I never felt loved. Love was there, scattered in small pockets. My father's hand on my shoulder when I got into nursing school. My mother pressing a warm washcloth to my forehead when I had strep throat at 16. But even those moments felt fragile, like thin glass that could crack under too much pressure. The favoritism toward Tyler wasn't always loud or cruel. Sometimes it was just the absence of attention toward me, the breath of a space where warmth should have been. As I grew older, the patterns didn't shift, they matured. When I brought home my acceptance letter for the nursing program, fresh ink still smelling faintly chemical, my father congratulated me with a brief squeeze to my arm before turning back to Tyler, who had just announced a new business idea involving custom sports gear. When I worked through double shifts in college, sleeping between classes, my mother praised my dedication, but kept her real pride reserved for any half-hearted milestone Tyler offered. He studied business for a semester before dropping out, and my parents told everyone he was taking time to find his direction. Meanwhile, my thin dorm mattress always smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old books because I lived in the cheapest housing I could manage. And yet, when I mentioned needing a second job, my mother said, "Sweetheart, don't wear yourself out," as if concern was enough to replace actual help. It didn't matter that I kept the lights on in my apartment with long hours at the student health center. It didn't matter that I came home for holidays with aching hands from helping in the ER. When Tyler came home with a new idea, a new request, a new story, no matter how far-fetched, they lit up the way porch lights glow in deep winter. Over time, I learned to shrink my needs until they felt like something I could tuck into a pocket. I learned to let praise roll off me before it could feel real, because real things were the first to be taken away. I learned that silence caused the least trouble, and trouble was the last thing our family needed. Looking back now, I can see how that quiet compliance seeped into everything I did. In relationships, I apologized before I even knew what for. At work, I took the hardest shifts without complaint because hard work was the only thing I trusted to speak for me. The hum of hospital machines became easier to read than the tones of my own parents' voices. And whenever someone offered me kindness, a warm cup of coffee from a coworker, a soft compliment about my patience, it felt like something I had to tiptoe around, careful not to let it slip from my grasp. But the truth is, those early years trained me to tolerate the intolerable. Every overlooked birthday, every unreturned smile, every moment, my achievements were drowned out by Tyler's latest detour. They all seeped into my understanding of what I deserved. So when the phone rang that night in the ER, when my mother's frantic voice cracked through the haze of exhaustion, I didn't question the weight she placed on me. I didn't pause to ask whether it was fair that she expected me to save the house. I didn't even let myself feel the initial sting when she mentioned Tyler's role in all of it. I simply absorbed it the way I had absorbed everything else. The faint chemical smell from the disinfected counters drifted into my lungs, grounding me as I pressed the phone tighter. I told her I'd help. I told her she didn't need to worry. My voice felt steady, practiced an echo of every moment I'd stepped aside to make room for someone else's crisis. For months afterward, I moved through life like I was underwater. The beeping monitors, the rattle of wheelchairs, the low murmur of voices in the waiting room. They all blended into a thick hum that carried me from one shift to the next. At home, the quiet felt heavy, the kind that settles deep into the walls. I convinced myself that the sacrifice was temporary, that this time things would change, that saving the house might finally make me visible. But there was always something I didn't fully understand, lingering beneath the surface. Little comments from my neighbor Mrs. Green about late-night arguments she overheard, the way my father avoided eye contact when I asked for updates, the stiff smile on my mother's face when I stopped by with groceries, her perfume drifting in a strange mix with the scent of fresh paint. Back then, I didn't know how close the truth was. I didn't know that somewhere in those small oddities, a strange pause, a tight smile, a stack of mail that never seemed to diminish lay the first cracks in the story they'd been feeding me for months. And standing there now, years later, I can still feel it, the quiet before something breaks. The envelope tears open with a soft, fibrous rip that echoes too loudly in the empty kitchen. The overhead light hums faintly, casting a pale glow on the stack of papers sliding out onto the counter. My fingers tremble as I flip the first page. Signatures dates a listing price highlighted in bold ink. The house address, my house address, stares up at me in sharp, merciless type. A contract. Already signed. Already processed. The smell of stale coffee from the cup I abandoned an hour ago mixes with the scent of paper and cold air as I shuffle through page after page. Then a second envelope thicker slips loose and lands on the floor with a muted thud. I kneel, the tiles cool beneath my knees, and pull it open. A cashier's check receipt, $10,000, a down payment. My breath catches as if someone has wrapped a hand around my throat. I press the edges of the contract flat with my palms, my skin prickling as my eyes race over the fine print. My parents' names. Tyler's name listed as authorized occupant. And then, in the space for ownership verification, I see the date 3 weeks ago, printed clean and unapologetic. A date when I was working back-to-back night shifts and picking up groceries for them before collapsing in my car for a few minutes of rest. A date when my mother hugged me in the doorway, her perfume sweet and familiar, her voice soft as she said, "We're finally turning a corner." I stare at those pages, the silence in the kitchen thick enough to feel. The truth sits there, cold and undeniable. For a long moment, all I hear is the faint hum of the refrigerator and the thin rasp of my own breath catching in my throat. It takes a few moments before the shock loosens its grip enough for thought to form. What I found on that counter changed everything, because it didn't just expose a lie, it revealed an entire history. I'd been too tired, too trusting, too hopeful to see clearly. The next few minutes unspool in my memory like a film I can't pause. I gather the papers into a shaky stack, the edges scraping softly against one another, and move into the living room. The hardwood feels cold beneath my bare feet, each step grounding me more deeply in the unfolding truth. When I sit on the floor, the emptiness around me seems to amplify every sound, my breathing, the faint rattle of branches outside the quiet rustle of documents as I spread them out around me, like pieces of a puzzle I've been avoiding for years. At first, the contract reads like any real estate listing measurements of rooms, photos taken in flattering afternoon light descriptions about good bones and investment potential. But the notes in the margins written in my father's neat accountant handwriting cut deeper than any official text. Buyer approved, closing next week, and scrawled at the bottom of a page, finally, out from under. The words sting more than I expect. I trace the ink with the tip of my finger, feeling the grooves left behind by the pen. My father always pressed hard when he wrote a habit he'd picked up, he once said, from years of signing tax forms and ledgers. Now that pressure has carved itself into the document representing the betrayal he didn't even bother to hide. I shift my attention to the receipt tucked behind the final page, a $10,000 down payment deposited into an account I don't recognize. I hold it closer to the light, the ink reflecting faintly. It isn't my parents' account, and it isn't Tyler's. It's a joint account under two names I don't know. I feel the faint scratch of panic at the back of my throat as I set it aside, realizing someone else, someone outside our family, has been involved in this for weeks, maybe months. On my knee rests a single sheet, one I almost missed, an email printed out from the realtor. The sentences are brief, clinical, laced with the confidence of someone who believes all parties are aligned. We look forward to finalizing the sale. All documentation appears complete. Please ensure the property is cleared by the 15th. Cleared. Not cleaned. Cleared. As in emptied. As in stripped. As in exactly the state I found my home in when I walked through the door. Curtains, gone. Furniture, gone. Photos, gone. The memory slices through me with chilling precision. The stark emptiness, the echo of my footsteps, the cold air that wasn't from an open window, but from absence itself. And then beneath the papers near the bottom of the stack, I find something even smaller, almost overlooked, a sticky note folded in half. I open it slowly. Make sure she doesn't find out until it's done. Written in my mother's looping, familiar cursive. The air leaves my lungs in a slow, uneven exhale. My chest tightens, not with confusion, but with the sharp clarity of a truth. I've spent years refusing to acknowledge this wasn't a sudden act of desperation. It was planned, carefully, quietly, deliberately. The contract's date, the down payment, the email reminders, the sticky note piece by piece, a timeline emerges. They started this before the refinancing paperwork, before the long nights I spent working double shifts, before the weeks I watched their carefully curated smiles, their reassurances, their calm tones when I asked if things were getting better. It hits me then hard and sudden how much they expected from my silence, how deeply they relied on it. I sink back against the wall, the paint cool against my shoulders, and close my eyes. The smell of the empty house, a faint mix of dust and missing warmth, settles around me. My hands rest in my lap, still clutching the sticky note. For the first time, I let myself step outside the memory and look at it without excuses. They weren't trying to survive. They were trying to escape. And they were willing to step over me to do it. The anger doesn't come in a rush. It comes like a slow tide, warm and steady, rising in the hollowed-out spaces where shock begins to fade. My heartbeat slows, grows heavier, thudding against my ribs with a kind of rhythmic certainty. I open my eyes and look again at the papers spread around me. Every question I'd ignored for months suddenly clicks into place. The hush in their voices when I walked into a room. The way my father's hand tightened around his phone when I asked about bills. The way my mother redirected conversations, her perfume trailing faintly as she walked away. The urgency behind their late-night cleaning sprees. Even the way Tyler avoided my eyes when I asked how his search for work was going. His foot tapping the floor in a pattern I recognized from childhood, a tell he never grew out of. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a coordinated removal. I realized with a hollow sort of calm that I wasn't meant to find any of this until it was all over. Until the house was sold. Until the money was gone. Until I was the last one left standing in a life they'd already vacated. And something in me, something small and quiet that has lived there for as long as I can remember, finally begins to shift. The part of me that swallowed disappointment. The part that steadied my voice when their tone went sharp. The part that stepped aside for every crisis they created. The part that believed love and sacrifice were the same thing. That part loosens just a little as the truth lays itself bare. I gather the documents into neat piles, smoothing the pages with a steadiness that feels foreign and startling. The edges whisper against each other as I slide them into a single folder. My movements are slow, deliberate, guided by a calm that has weight behind it. My fingertips are cold, but my jaw is set. By the time I stand, I feel taller in a way that has nothing to do with height. The house is still empty around me, silent, echoing, but it no longer feels like a tomb. It feels like a boundary line, a turning point I didn't ask for, but now understand deeply. I turn toward the window where the faint light of early evening filters through the bare glass. The air smells faintly metallic, like the beginning of a storm. I reach for my coat, the fabric rough under my fingers, and gather the folder tightly under my arm. I know exactly where I'm going. Tonight, I decide I won't wait for explanations. I won't wait for another lie dressed as reassurance. I won't sit quietly and absorb the weight of their choices. I will confront the truth while it is still warm in my hands. And for the first time in my life, I feel prepared for whatever comes next. The dining room goes silent the moment I place the folder on the table. The soft thump sounds louder than it should, echoing against the glassware and the low hum of the overhead light. My mother freezes with her hand hovering over the serving dish, the steam rising from it curling around her wrist. My father's fork slips from his fingers and clatters against the plate, the metallic ring slicing through the quiet. Tyler leans back in his chair, his jaw tight, his heel tapping the hardwood in a nervous rhythm. I open the folder slowly, each page, whispering, as I flip it over and slide the contract into the center of the table. The edges brush against the tablecloth crisp and unforgiving. "You all should see this," I say, my voice steady, almost calm. The entire room tilts toward the paper, toward the truth that's about to land like a dropped stone. And that right there is where everything began to unwind. But let me take you to the moments that led us to this table, this silence, this reckoning. I didn't sleep much the night before. The house felt too still, the air too heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to act. I lay on the couch, listening to the faint buzz of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling in the cool organ air. The folder sat on the coffee table, its corners sharp under the lamplight, a reminder that I finally held something my family could no longer twist into another story. By morning, the sky was a soft gray, a thin layer of mist hugging the neighborhood. I stood at the sink, sipping coffee that tasted more bitter than usual, when the idea finally crystallized. If I confronted them in private, they would deny it, redirect it, turn it into another story about my overreaction. But in front of others, before they had time to rehearse or retreat, truth would have nowhere to hide. So, when my mother texted that afternoon, inviting me to Sunday dinner to mend things, I knew it wasn't an olive branch. It was a gathering meant to fold me back into silence, but it gave me exactly what I needed, an audience. My parents had invited a few neighbors, including Mrs. Green, to show we're a united family again. Their words, not mine. I tucked the folder under my arm, feeling its weight as I walked up the driveway. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves and the rosemary my mother planted along the walkway. Inside the house was warm, thick, with the scent of pot roast and buttered rolls. I saw familiar faces, neighbors I'd known since childhood, people who'd watched me grow up. My mother greeted them with her practiced smile, her voice syrupy, as she recounted how proud she was that her daughter was a nurse. When she spotted me, her smile tightened, stretched at the corners. "Nora," she said warmly, but her eyes darted to the folder I carried. I waited. I sat. I watched them pretend nothing had happened. I watched my father laugh too loudly at a joke, watched Tyler push food around his plate without really eating. Watched my mother's shoulders tense every time I shifted in my chair. The air grew thick, and even the clink of cutlery sounded cautious. I waited until the plates were nearly empty and the room had settled into a small, humming quiet. Then I stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hovered in midair. The steam from the pot roast curled upward, dissolving into the stillness. And I placed the folder on the table. My mother's face drained first, a faint tremor flickering across her mouth. My father's shoulders stiffened, his knuckles whitening against the arm of his chair. Tyler stopped tapping his foot. "This," I said, sliding the contract forward so the overhead light washed across it, "is the sale agreement for my house." Someone shifted in their seat, the fabric rustling softly. The room, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. My father cleared his throat. "Nora," he said, his voice strained. "This isn't the time. It's exactly the time." I turned the pages one by one, my fingertips brushing the paper. The signatures stared up at us, clear, deliberate, dated. "You signed this 3 weeks ago," I continued. "While I was working nights. While I was bringing you groceries. While Mom told me everything was getting better." My mother blinked rapidly, her earrings swaying. "You're misunderstanding." I placed another page on the table, the sticky note with her handwriting. "Make sure she doesn't find out until it's done." The intake of breath around the table was almost a chorus. Mrs. Green's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly. Even my father's face went slack, like he hadn't expected that piece of evidence. Tyler stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the wood in a harsh screech. "This isn't fair." He snapped hands, balling into fists. "We needed to do something. You wouldn't help us anymore. So..." Before he could finish, I pulled out the printed statement from the bank. The air in the room felt suddenly sharp. "You opened a joint account," I said quietly, "using my social security number." My mother's hand flew to her chest. "We would never..." "You did." I tapped the page lightly, the paper giving a soft thud under my knuckle. "This is identity misuse, Mom. You used my number to open an account for the down payment you took from the buyers?" Gasps rippled around the table. Mrs. Green's fork slipped from her fingers and landed on the plate with a dull clink. My father sputtered. Nora, sweetheart, we didn't think it would matter." "It matters," I said softly. "It matters a lot." The room tilted subtly. The balance of power always slanted against me suddenly shifted. I lifted the last document I'd brought with me, an email thread between my father and the realtor, where he instructed her to make sure the sale goes through before Nora asks questions. My father's face turned a mottled shade of red. My mother pressed her napkin to her mouth. Tyler looked like he might bolt. Neighbors exchanged glances, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. "You planned it," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "You planned to sell the house I paid for. You emptied it. You used my identity. And you meant to leave me with absolutely nothing." My mother's voice broke. "We didn't think you'd make it difficult." That sentence hung there naked and cruel, louder than any shouting could have been. I closed the folder. "You didn't think I'd stand up for myself." Silence pressed into every corner of the room, dense and unmoving. Even the pot roast had gone cold. My father tried once more. "We're still your family, Nora." I met his eyes. Family doesn't do this. A long breath moved through the room, as though every person sitting there felt something shift. They weren't just witnessing conflict. They were witnessing truth stripped and unvarnished. I slid the folder under my arm. "I'm done saving people who won't save themselves. The house is legally mine. The sale is void. And the next steps you face are yours alone." I stepped back from the table. My chair remained empty, its cushions still warm from where I'd been sitting. I walked toward the hallway, the floor cool under my feet, the murmurs rising behind me in an uneasy wave. I didn't turn around. As I reached the doorway, Mrs. Green's voice floated toward me, a quiet, steady murmur. "Good for you, Nora." The room behind me fell into stunned, heavy silence, and I walked out into the cool evening air. The truth finally out the wait, finally shifting, ready to rebuild a life that didn't require me to shrink to fit someone else's needs. When I stepped out of that dining room, the night air felt colder than it should have, brushing against my skin like a hand guiding me forward. The porch light hummed overhead, casting a soft golden circle onto the steps, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to rush, no urge to explain myself to the voices rising behind the closed door. I drew in a long breath, the cool air filling my chest in a way that made me almost lightheaded. It was quiet out there, just the soft clicking of my heels on the walkway and the rustle of leaves as a gentle breeze moved through the hedges. With every step toward my car, something inside me loosened, as if long-tied knots were finally unraveling. My hands trembled, not with fear this time, but with release. Something had shifted. The weight I had carried for most of my life no longer belonged to me. It's strange how silence can feel like freedom when you've spent years drowning in other people's noise. That night marked the beginning of a different kind of living, one I had to learn almost from scratch. In the days that followed, the house seemed to breathe differently each time I opened the door, its emptiness no longer threatening, but expectant, like a blank page waiting to be written on. The smell of dust had settled into the corners after my family stripped it bare, but scrubbing the walls filled the air with the scent of lemon and fresh paint. I worked room by room, the soft scrape of the paint roller against the drywall becoming a steady rhythm that grounded me. Sunlight drifted across the floors during the afternoons, warm patches of light shifting slowly across the boards, as if the house itself were stretching awake. Reclaiming the space wasn't just about restoring what had been taken. It was about discovering what I wanted for the first time in a long time. I bought curtains in a soft linen that caught the morning light in delicate folds, making the house feel gentler. I replaced the harsh overhead bulbs with warm-toned lamps that gave the rooms a softer glow. Each small act, a shelf hung straight. A new plant resting on the windowsill felt like stitching together something that had been torn long before the furniture disappeared. It surprised me how healing the simplest actions became. Replacing the locks one crisp evening, the metal cool under my fingertips, I realized I no longer feared who might try to walk through my door. Planting small marigold seedlings along the front walkway, I felt soil crumble between my fingers, the earthy scent rising in the spring air. These were quiet acts, but each one gave me back a piece of myself I didn't realize I'd lost. My parents and Tyler tried reaching out in the days after the confrontation. A voicemail from my father filled with strained apologies. A text from my mother insisting we talk like a family. Tyler's message curt and clipped, blaming me for the fallout. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I finally understood that peace requires distance. Silence wasn't punishment. It was protection. Instead of engaging in old patterns, I sent a single formal email. All communication regarding the house must go through my attorney. I wish you well. It was the calmest boundary I had ever set, and it held. As the weeks passed, something unexpected began to flourish around me. People I'd known for years stepped in with small kindnesses that softened the edges of my days. Jennifer from the ER stopped by after late shifts with containers of homemade soup that warmed the kitchen with the scent of garlic and herbs. Mrs. Green brought over a stack of old photo frames she'd saved polished and ready for new memories. She didn't ask questions. She simply set them on my counter, her smile warm and steady. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, I found a note taped to my front door. It was from Mike in radiology. He'd seen me eyeing a woodworking bench at a garage sale the week before and had offered to pick it up for me if I wanted it. Sure enough, the bench sat on my porch, smelling faintly of fresh sawdust. I stood there for a long moment, touched by the quiet generosity of people who had no obligation to me beyond simple humanity. Slowly, these friendships wove themselves into the shape of something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: connection without expectation, support without cost. It didn't erase the past, but it eased the ache. Work also became a place where I reclaimed part of my identity. I took on mentoring a new nursing student, Lucia, a bright young woman whose questions filled the quiet moments between patient rounds. Watching her find her footing reminded me of the early years of my own career, when my confidence wavered, but my dedication was strong. Guiding her felt natural, and in doing so, I discovered a new sense of purpose that didn't rely on anyone's approval but my own. The biggest change came the day I finally cleared out my father's old office. The room had always been dim, the blinds drawn tight, papers stacked high in unstable piles. As I opened the blinds for the first time, the light spilled across the dusty carpet in a bright, warm sweep. I spent hours sorting through boxes, letting go of things that no longer belonged in my life. By evening, the room felt different, lighter, open. That was the night I moved my pottery wheel in. Clay has a quiet patience to it. The cool weight of it in my hands, the slow spin of the wheel, the faint grit under my nails. It all forced me to move slower, breathe deeper. The first bowl I shaped was slightly uneven, but it felt like a small miracle. Creating something new from something formless worked its way into me, a reminder that rebuilding doesn't have to look perfect to be meaningful. Weeks passed, then months, and the house once emptied in betrayal grew into a place shaped by intention and choice. My choice. On a warm summer evening, I found myself sitting on the front steps, the smell of blooming rosemary drifting through the air. Fireflies blinked in and out of the dusk, small sparks of light in the gathering dark. I listened to the steady hum of the neighborhood distant laughter, a dog barking the soft swish of passing cars, and realized I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt at home. This journey taught me that sometimes the hardest boundaries we draw are the ones that finally allow us to breathe. That healing is not a sudden transformation, but a quiet returning to oneself. And that letting go of the people who harm us doesn't leave us empty. It makes room for the life we were meant to build. In the end, I learned that peace doesn't always come when the world softens. Sometimes it comes when you finally do.